In this video, you're going to learn how to use Express Middleware. Express Middleware is a fantastic tool. It allows you to add on to the existing functionality that Express has. So if Express doesn't do something you'd like it to do, you can add some middleware and teach it how to do that thing. Now, we've already used a little bit of middleware. Right here on line 8, we use some middleware, and we teach Express how to read from a static directory. We call app.use, which is how you register middleware. Then we provide the middleware function we want to use. Now, middleware can do anything. You could just execute some code, like logging something to the screen. You could make a change to the request or the response object. We'll be doing just that in later sections when we add API authentication. We'll want to make sure the right header is sent. That header is going to be expected to have an API token. We can use middleware to determine whether or not someone's logged in, basically whether or not they should be able to access a specific route. And we can also use middleware to respond to a request. We could send something back from the middleware just like we would anywhere else, using response.render or response.send. Now, in order to explore middleware, we're going to create some basic middleware right now. Just below where we call app.use, registering our Express static middleware, we're going to call app.use again. Now, app.use is how you register middleware, and it takes a function. Right here, we're going to pass in an arrow function. The use function takes just one function. There is no need to add any other arguments. This function is going to get called with the request object, the response object, and a third argument, next. Now, request and response, those should seem familiar by now. It's the exact same arguments we get whenever we register a handler down below. Next is where things get a little trickier. Next exists so you can tell Express when your middleware function is done. And this is useful because you can have as much middleware as you like registered to a single Express app. For example, I have some middleware that serves up a directory. We're going to write some more that logs some request data to the screen. And we could have a third piece down below that helps with application performance, keeping track of response times. All of that is possible. Now, inside of this function, we can do anything we like. We might log something to the screen. We might make a database request to make sure a user is authenticated. All of that is perfectly valid. And we use next to tell Express when we're done. So if we do something asynchronous, the middleware is not going to move on. Only when we call next, like this, will the application continue to run. Now, this means if your middleware doesn't call next, your handlers for each request, they're never going to fire. We can prove this. Right here, I'm going to call app.use, passing in an empty function. I'm going to save the file, and over in the terminal, I'm going to run our app using nodemon with server.js. I'm going to do this. I'm going to move into the browser, and I'll make a request for the home page. I'm going to refresh the page, and you can see that up top it is trying to load, but it's never going to finish. Now, it's not that it can't connect to the server. It's connecting to the server just fine. The real problem is that inside of our app, we have middleware that doesn't call next. To fix this, all we're going to do is call next like this. Now, when things refresh over inside of the browser, we get our home page exactly as we expected. The only difference is now we have a place where we can add on some functionality. Right inside of here, we're going to get started by creating a logger that's going to log out all of the requests that come into the server. We're also going to store a timestamp so we can see exactly when someone made a request for a specific URL. To get started inside of the middleware, let's go ahead and get the current time. I'm going to make a variable called now, setting it equal to new date, creating a new instance of our date object, and I'm going to call its toString method. ToString creates a nice formatted date, a human-readable timestamp. Now that we have our now variable in place, we can go ahead and start creating the actual logger by calling console.log. I can call console.log, passing in whatever I like. I'm going to pass in inside of ticks the now variable with a colon after. We'll tack on some more data in just a moment. Now, if I save my file, things are going to restart over in the terminal because nodemon is running. And when I make a request for the site again, and I go into the terminal, I should see my log. And right here, I have my log. Currently, it's just a timestamp, but we are on the right track. Now, everything is working because we call next. So after this console.log call prints to the screen, our application continues and it serves up the page. Inside of here, we can add on more functionality by exploring that request object. On the request object, we have access to everything about the request, the HTTP method, the path, query parameters, anything that comes from the client, whether that client's an app, a browser, or an iPhone, it is all going to be available in that request object. Two things we're going to pull off now is the HTTP method and the path. If you want to look at a full list of the things you have access to, you can go to expressjs.com, go to API reference. We happen to be using a 4.x version of Express, so I'm going to click that link. Then on the right, we have both request and response. We're looking for the request object, so we'll click that. We're going to be using two request.url and request.method. Back inside of Atom, we can start implementing those, adding them into console.log. Right after the timestamp, we're going to print the HTTP method. We'll be using other methods later. For now, we've only used the get method. Right inside of here, I'm going to inject request.method, printing it to the console. Next up, we can go ahead and print the path so we know exactly what page the person requested. I'm going to do that by injecting another variable, request.url. With this in place, we now have a pretty useful piece of middleware. It takes the request object, it spits out some information, and then it moves on, letting the server process the request down below. If I save the file and I rerun the app from the browser, I should be able to move into the terminal and see this new logger printing to the screen. And right here, we get just that. We have our timestamp, we have the HTTP method, which is get, and we have the path. If I change the path to something more complicated, like /about, and I move back into the terminal, we're going to see that /about right here where we accessed request.url. Now, this is a pretty basic example of some middleware. We can take it a step further. Aside from just logging a message to the screen, we're also going to print that message to a file. Let's go ahead and load in fs up above. I'm going to create a constant, call that constant fs, and set that equal to the return result from requiring the module. Awesome. Now we can go ahead and implement that down below. I'm going to take our template string, which is currently defined inside of console log. I'm going to cut it out and instead store it in a variable. I'm going to make a variable called log, setting it equal to that template string. Now we can pass that log variable into both console.log and into an fs method to write to our file system. I'm going to call fs.append file. Now, as you remember, append file lets you add on to a file. It takes two arguments, the file name and the thing you want to add. The file name we're going to use is server.log. We'll create a nice log file, and the actual contents is just going to be the log message up above, and we are going to need to add one more thing. We also want to move on to the next line after every single request gets logged, so I'm going to concatenate the new line character, which is going to be \n. Perfect. Hello, this is Andrew, a few months after the Node course was originally released. If you're using Node v7 or greater, you're going to need to make a small tweak to this line. As you can see here, we added a third argument to fs.append file. This is a callback function. It's now required. If you don't have a callback function, you're going to get a deprecation warning over inside of the console. Now, as you can see, our callback function here takes an error argument. If there is an error, we just print a message to the screen. That's it. If you change your line to look like this, regardless of your Node version, you'll be future-proof. If you're on Node v7 or greater, the warning in the console will go away. Now, the warning is going to say something like deprecation warning, calling an asynchronous function without callback is deprecated. If you see that warning, make this change. All right, let's get back to it. Now that we have this in place, we can go ahead and test things out. I saved the file, which should be restarting things over inside of NodeMon. NodeMon is restarted right now. And inside of Chrome, I can go ahead and give the page a refresh. If I head back into the terminal, I do still get my log, which is great. Notice I also have a request for favicon.ico. This is usually the icon that's shown in the browser tab. I have one cached from a previous project. There actually is no icon file defined, which is totally fine. The browser still makes the request anyways, which is why that shows up here. Inside of Atom, we now have our server.log file. And if I open it up, right here, we have a log of all the requests that were made. We have timestamps, we have HTTP methods, and we have paths. And this is pretty awesome. Using app.use, we were able to create some middleware that helps us keep track of how our server is working. Now, there are times where you might not want to call next. We learned that we could call next after we do something asynchronous, like read from a database, but imagine something goes wrong. You can avoid calling next to never move on to the next piece of middleware. And that's exactly what you're going to do in the challenge for this video. What I would like you to do is create a new view inside the views folder. Go ahead and call this one maintenance.hbs. This is going to be a handlebars template we'll render when the site is in maintenance mode. You can give it a really simple structure, copy it from home or about, just some basic HTML. There's no reason to use the partials. All I want you to do is render an H1 tag, something like "we'll be right back," and a paragraph tag, something like "the site is currently being updated, we'll be back soon." Now, once you make that maintenance.hbs template file, I want you to render it inside of a new piece of middleware. We don't have that middleware defined yet. You're going to have to call app.use again, defining the function. But inside of there, you'll be able to call response.render just like you did down below. There's no difference between the response object you get here in a request handler and the response object you get in middleware. They are exactly the same object. That means you only need to add one line inside of the middleware. You just have to call response.render. No need to call next, since we don't actually want to move on to the rest of the request. We simply want to stop it rendering the maintenance.hbs file to the screen. So take a moment to knock all that out. It's going to require you to call app.use, define the function, and add one call inside of the function. Once you're done, go ahead and test it out. Try to make a request to a page and see what happens when you do that. You should get your template from maintenance.hbs printing instead. Take a moment, pause the video, knock that out, and when you're done, click play. All right, I know that one might have been a little tricky. Hopefully you didn't have too much trouble getting that set up. The first thing I'm going to do is make the maintenance.hbs file by duplicating home.hbs. I'm going to call the file maintenance.hbs. And inside of maintenance.hbs, all I'm going to do is wipe the body and add a few tags. Right here, I'll add an H1 tag to print a little message to the user. I'm going to go ahead and use something like "we'll be right back." Down below, I can go ahead and add a paragraph tag. Notice there I was able to use P followed by the tab. This is a shortcut inside of Atom for creating an HTML tag. It works for all tags. I could type body and hit enter, or I could type P and hit enter. Inside the paragraph, I'm going to leave a little message. The site is currently being updated. Perfect. Now that we have our template file in place, we can go ahead and define our maintenance middleware, which is going to bypass all of our other handlers where we render other files and print JSON, and instead, it'll just render this template to the screen. I'm going to save the file, move into server.js, and define that middleware. Right here, I can call app.use, passing in our function. The function is going to take those three arguments: request, response, and next. Down below, all we're going to need to do is call response.render. Response.render, passing in the name of the file we want to render. In this case, it's maintenance.hbs. And there we go. That is all you needed to do to set up our maintenance middleware. This middleware is going to stop everything after it from executing. We don't call next, so the actual handlers right here, they are never going to get executed. We can prove this. Over inside of the browser, I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page. And what do I get? I get the maintenance page. I can go to the home page, and I get the exact same thing. If you see this, then you completed the challenge successfully. Now, there's one more really important piece to middleware I haven't yet talked about, and you might have seen it if you tested out your maintenance middleware. Remember inside of that public folder, right there, we have a help.html file. If I visit that in the browser by going to /help.html, I'm going to still get that help page. I'm not getting the maintenance page. That is because middleware is executed in the order you call app.use, which means the first thing we do is we set up our Express static directory, then we set up our logger, and finally we set up our maintenance.hbs logger. This is a pretty big problem. If we also want to make the public directory files like help.html private, we're going to have to reorder our calls to app.use. Because currently the Express server is responding inside of the Express static middleware, so our maintenance middleware doesn't get a chance to execute. I'm going to take the app.use Express static call, remove it from the file, and add it down below after we render the maintenance file to the screen. Now everything is going to work as expected. No matter what, we're going to log the request, which is great. Then we'll check if we're in maintenance mode, if this thing is here. If it is, we'll render the maintenance file. If it's not, we'll ignore it because it'll be commented out or something like that. And finally, we'll be using Express Static. This is going to fix all those problems. If I re-render the app now, I get the maintenance page on help.html. If I go back to the root of the website, I still get the maintenance page, which is great. Now, once I'm done with my maintenance middleware, I can always go ahead and comment it out. This is going to remove it from being executed, and the website will work as expected. We'll log some stuff, we'll render our static files, and we'll also be rendering our other routes down below. With it commented out, I can now refresh and get my home page back, which is awesome. This has been a quick dive into Express middleware. We're going to be using it a lot more throughout the course. We'll be using middleware to check if our API requests are actually authenticated. Inside of the middleware, we'll be making a database request, checking if the user is indeed who they say they are. That's coming up later though. For now, in the rest of this section, we're going to worry about adding version control and deploying our applications. Because when it comes to creating real-world Node apps, deploying your app to the web is obviously a pretty big part of that. It's all coming up next, starting with Git, so stay tuned. I will see you then.